I'm really excited about being here today because one of the things that I think has happened over the years is we've often heard from the press, it's almost like a blame game where either parents are blamed or teachers are blamed, and sometimes even children are blamed for not having the literacy skills that they should have. And one of the things that Evelyn talked about so importantly is it really does take a village, that we have to understand that reading is a science of reading, is a science of implementation. It's not just about the skills related to reading, it's about creating an infrastructure of people working together to ensure that our children are successful. One of the things I know, and I know Evelyn, I can see you saying it, is that our children are very bright. They're very special. And there's enormous potential out there, but often that potential is not realized, and it's not their fault. It's the fault very often of a system. The fact that we have allowed these children, unfortunately, to fail because we haven't had the system well enough in place. And so I'm delighted to hear from our speakers today, because I think they're among the first who really call out the complexity of what it means to have a real science of implementation of reading. And I think they point to areas that we need to come together in order to really be successful. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarah, first, and then to take it away and give us some overview remarks.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gabriel, do you want to start our slides and launch us?
Yeah, just waiting for screen sharing permissions. And as I do, I think, Dr. Newman, thank you so much for giving us that. Oh, good, I'm the co-host now. Cue that music that you play in your mind when you're trying to do things and talk over them at the same time. Sure, right, like that. You've given us such a broad and beautiful introduction to the importance and the far-reaching importance of getting it right when it comes to change and improvement in literacy teaching and learning. And I think I want to contextualize this just even further, thinking about how reading instruction has always been a site for policy, a place where it is the most legislated area of all of education. And it also is particularly pivotal, not just right now in our history, but also right now in the short term in season 3 of the pandemic. And in a time when states have funding that they maybe never have had before or haven't had in a very long time to concentrate on things like curriculum materials and tutoring programs and professional development for teachers. There's this huge infusion of funds as part of our recovery effort, and people are really working hard to figure out what to do with that. What is the wisest and most evidence-based pathway forward for literacy instruction? And at the same time, and not unrelated, 13 states so far have passed laws that write the term science of reading into the legislation, that mandate a particular approach, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, into the law of each state. And many states are currently considering this legislation. I expect that that number will double or triple in the next year or so. And so this is sort of the context. And if we think about how policy and policy implementation have worked in reading over the last 20 years or so, we have some ideas and answers about what this might look like. So we can think about a first wave of reading policy that had all of the same components of the science of reading policies that we see coming out right now. And in that first wave, which many of our states passed in the late 90s or early 2000s, it was really focused on school reform as a whole, which I think is similar to this moment. We're thinking about how do we do school again now in this world, and also thinking about kind of collective needs to move forward with improvement and equity work in the area of literacy. And then in the last 5 or 10 years, 5 or 6 in most cases, 47 states passed dyslexia-specific legislation that doubled down on a lot of the things that we saw in that first wave. And these are the same 5 policy strategies that we see in the new science of reading legislation. They all have the same 5 parts, and those 5 parts are very familiar to us as educators. It's the idea that the assessments that we use need to be based on the science of reading. The curriculum that we use needs to be based on the science of reading. The professional development that teachers get needs to be focused in some states exclusively, and in other states just maybe focused on the science of reading. And that teacher preparation and teacher testing also has to fall in line, as does intervention. Now, those were the 5 targets in the first wave, when our focus was scientifically based reading research, and in the second wave, when the focus was evidence-based, particularly with the idea of identifying and supporting students with a profile of reading difficulty we understand as dyslexia. And now with the science of reading. And so we see this sort of narrowing or doubling down and tripling down on this set of strategies. And the interesting thing about that set of strategies is that they don't deal directly with implementation. They really are mandates. We shall. And in fact, if you search the word shall in the text of these legislative documents, it comes up about a bazillion times. We shall use science of reading based products, approaches, tools, trainings, and preparation. Now, any policy that is just mandate and no process to it kind of embraces, and I think a lot of our conversations that I read in the media and in social media embrace this kind of simple view of policy implementation, where someone creates a policy and then a change happens, and then there's measurable evidence of that change. And if we don't see measurable evidence of that change, then somebody in the middle screwed up. Or even if we don't see the change happen in the first place, somebody in the middle screwed up. And this is concerning to me and my colleague Sarah and to many of us on this call today, because the people in the middle are the educators. And in many cases, like Susan said, starting off this conversation, there are conditions and contexts that prevent a simple direct translation of the policy into practice. Despite best intentions, full understanding, and full desire to make that happen, there are contexts and conditions that limit that. And then there are the realities of people as humans having their own understandings and interpretations of what that policy is and can be and can do. And then there's the idea that if the goal is integration of these policies into the daily fabric of literacy teaching and learning, if we don't want science of reading work to just be sort of a surface level compliance thing, we want it to actually be deeply woven and integrated into the work of teachers and leaders, so that students are fully experiencing a coherent and powerful instructional experience informed by the science of reading. Then it can't just be that we measure impact, we also have to measure process. How do we get to this place? And we have to be as concerned with how we get there as we are with what the there is. And as somebody who pays attention a little bit to social media and a lot to newspapers, I can tell you that most of what I see floating around out there is discussion and debate about where we want to get to. What is the science of reading, and what should it look like in classrooms, and what shouldn't it look like in classrooms? And there is very little out there at the moment about what should and could these processes look like. So Sarah and I have been talking about how the science of reading is really missing. It lacks implementation science and improvement science, which are fields of knowledge that talk about how change happens in complicated organizations like schools. We have a set of understandings here, always changing, not settled science, always changing and developing, but still a set of understandings that can guide what we expect, how we can support it, and how we can plan and kind of get ahead of some of the things that we know are going to be complications, things that will make it difficult for individual educators and their schools and their districts to just immediately make that change and see the result, which is what we hope will happen, but know is going to be more complicated than that. So I want to take a quick second and just talk about how the science of reading itself complicates this a little bit. The answer to this question is it depends on who you ask and the context in which they're speaking and in the community that they are informed by. And in different communities, the science of reading is quite narrowly defined. And these definitions do have something in common with each other, but part of the challenge of implementation is that people have varied ideas about what counts as the science of reading, or should count as the science of reading, and what that means for their practice. And so I know this is a lot of sort of text heavy, but what I want you to notice in the pattern here is the word suggest. There is no written in stone, handed down on a tablet on a mountaintop version of this. But when people invoke the term science of reading, I think that it is meant to suggest this body of research, which there is sort of debate about the boundaries of that, but this body of research that has produced a set of understandings that we're ready to apply to classroom practice. It also is often used to suggest that common classroom practices are not yet reflective of what's known by scientists about how to teach children to read. And that also suggests that there is a norm or an average or a generalization we can use to capture what happens in classrooms, which is not something that I believe. I believe there is tremendous variation in what happens in classrooms across the country, let alone across the state, and even between classrooms right next door to each other in the same school, there's significant variation in what is taught and how. It also suggests that the commonly used texts and resources and curricula are not reflective of this body of knowledge. And so that means that many of these things need to be replaced or revised or refined. And so the conversation about the science of reading is often a conversation about replacing the curriculum, the assessments used, the processes and the tools and the resources that make reading instruction happen in K-3 public schools. And finally, in terms of sort of identifying the body of knowledge that is shaping these decisions, shaping what gets replaced, the most common thing across definitions is that it highlights findings about the importance of explicit, systematic phonics and phonemic awareness instruction in early literacy. And those findings most particularly come from studies from cognitive science and neuroscience. Whether or not what I said about the science of reading resonates completely with the way that you've been talking about it in your particular communities, or whether you see yourself in one area or another of the kind of broad spectrum that I'm trying to sketch for us. The science of reading is insufficient for the policies being written about it right now. Policies that ask us to change the way we teach, what we use to teach, what we use to measure that, how we prepare teachers. That comprehensive 5-pronged policy strategy is insufficient on its own. Similarly, new curricular programs, simply replacing the curriculum, is insufficient on its own to change practice. And just changing what individual teachers know, sending teachers to a training, which is part of the, even if you specify the training, even if it's the greatest training in the world, it's not sufficient on its own to make sure that we make necessary shifts for high quality literacy instruction that reflects the best of what we know in all of our K-3 classrooms. We do have to have this systems approach, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Sarah to think more about what that looks like and what it means for us. This is not, I mean, it's not new news. This would be true whether we were talking about a change related to math curriculum or a change related to needing to support needing to integrate trauma-informed practices, or a change related to needing to incorporate a different approach to social studies or approach to math. The change itself is not specific to reading that this is a challenge. Anytime we want instructional improvement, we have to consider the structures that are there to ensure improvement can happen. And think about those structures as either enabling or limiting factors. And we are focused here on these structures, the conditions, the leadership, because otherwise the only way to understand what happened is to blame a group of professionals without evidence about the ways that their conditions for working, their tools and resources, and the way that the policies are communicated to them has a big impact on what they do and how successful they are. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think that in that previous slide, something that I really appreciate and wanted to call out is that the points related to the infrastructure for instructional improvement are based in some of the broader literature on implementation science. And so just as Rachel said, some of these attention to some of these conditions, including leadership and the nature and quality of PD, are borrowed and drawn from different cases of change across districts and schools. And with the reminder that when these conditions are in place and when we pay attention to what's the nature of current conditions and also work to try to improve these conditions, that's when we're actually setting up educators across levels of the system for success, to actually engage in change and carry out change to benefit kids. So we've worked to sort of map out 3 components of the infrastructure for improving reading instruction. And the first is curriculum, the second is professional development, and the third is leadership. And I'll be digging into sort of each of these 3. And in a way, this diagram is helpful because it shows these 3 branches of the infrastructure. And spoiler alert, towards the end, we're going to kind of break down this and kind of throw this diagram out the window by saying that it's really important that these things overlay. And so something that Rachel and I have had conversations about and that I've noticed both in my research, my teaching, and my service is that sometimes these things are overly siloed. Certain folks, both in research and practice, may pay a lot of attention to curriculum, but not necessarily leadership. I mean, frankly, I'm in a leadership department, or I've worked in leadership departments across institutions, and the leadership departments are on a different part of the building than the curriculum and instruction folks. So this is sort of recreated across levels of the system. And similarly, I've spoken with many practitioners who note that within central office, sometimes the curriculum office and the folks who lead chief of academics are in a different spot than folks who do leadership development and are working with principals and such. So in just a moment, I'm going to dive into each of these and sort of think through, if we want to enable deep changes linked to the science of reading, what does curriculum need to look like? What do we do to improve curriculum to advance the science of reading? Secondly, similarly with professional development, how are we taking a pulse on the degree to which PD on the science of reading is aligned, matches what we know about quality and effective PD, is stretched across levels of the system? And then thirdly, in terms of leadership, what are leaders doing to support all of this work related to the science of reading? And how are these things working together in concert and not clashing with each other? And how are they accounting for local needs? So first, diving a bit into the curriculum angle, it feels really important to take a pulse on the coherence and the cohesiveness of the curriculum. And related to this, is the curriculum that's linked to the science of reading feasible? Is it accessible to teachers and leaders? To what degree is it addressing multiple strands of literacy? So something that Rachel really explained is that in certain communities, the science of reading is extremely focused on issues of phonics. And how are we addressing across strands of literacy? And how are we addressing sort of the complex view of how students learn reading skills and develop reading skills and strategies? And of course, how we're teaching all of those strands of literacy. And then finally, as I jump around within this curriculum tile, how is it aligned to the needs of districts, of schools, of educators, and of students? And how is it matched to what teachers may be currently doing, or they did 5 years ago, or 15 years ago, or the PD they received on curriculum a few years ago or currently? So in terms of the second pillar of the infrastructure for reading instructional improvement, we turn to professional development. And really strategically here, we're thinking about what are the ongoing learning opportunities for educators across levels of the system on the science of reading and on reading instruction. And here we're being really careful to not talk about trainings. And so some of the science of reading policies have moved into the training sphere, and online, it's a very sort of branded approach of this is the time and the space and the venue where educators will learn about the science of reading and gain access to those ideas and information. And it is not to say that that should not be in place, but that is insufficient if that is the only sort of touch point. It is unlikely and or impossible from what we know about how adults learn and about how professional learning operates for folks to sort of learn through that sort of one shot, even if it's an extended duration one shot approach. And so here we're sort of asking again that both leaders and reformers and policymakers think through how are professional learning opportunities aligned to the reading curriculum. So if you're listening carefully, it links back to that previous slide. So we're trying to match up that quality curriculum is in place, and now we're sort of layering and braiding with it this idea of professional learning on that specific curriculum, and that it's matched in a tailored way, not matched in a national or statewide way that may not match the context. And secondly, attention to the idea that professional learning on the science of reading should be ongoing and contextualized. It could involve coaching. It could be folded into PLC time. So again, the time you learn about the science of reading is not just the state-approved reading PD session. It's threaded throughout the school year. It's threaded throughout different forms of formal and informal professional development and contact with other educators. As a result of this contextualized nature, it becomes tailored to educators' strengths and their areas of need. And finally, something that, again, has percolated more and more is this idea of shared learning opportunities for teachers, coaches, principals, and district administrators. And we'll return to this when we talk about leadership, but there's this notion that we are not going to be able to advance and improve reading instruction if all of the weight and all of the work is on teachers' shoulders, and if teachers are the ones who must learn everything about science of reading and then do the science of reading. Instead, we need to think about this in a really layered way. Coaches who are supporting teachers also need to be learning about science of reading. Principals who are supporting perhaps both coaches and teachers need to be learning about science of reading as well. And district administrators also need that sort of that work and that learning and capacity building around science of reading and the current curriculum, so that the system can move forward together.
I'm going to hop in for a second here. The reason that we have these sort of silly little images of palettes on the side is to just really recognize that as we think about engaging folks at various levels of a school or district in learning opportunities related to the science of reading, we want to acknowledge that this is not new learning for everybody, and that we all kind of have past experiences and past trainings kind of under our belt, past tools and resources that we carry with us across the different schools we've worked in, different grade levels, different trainings that we've attended. And so if we sort of look across a room full of educators, it's almost as if we all have our own palettes, and a brand new teacher might have a clean brush, but the rest of us who are not brand new have this different combinations of exposures and understandings and tools that they've used or tools that they've heard about, and they are all trying to match and integrate this information so that they can produce the same kind of instruction that we're hoping for. And for some people, that's a really small change, and they're almost there. And for some people, it's a very big change, and that's not going to be state by state or district by district. That's going to be individual by individual. And so making sure that the professional development opportunities are varied, so that we're not asking seasoned literacy coaches to sit through a presentation on the basics of the science of reading that they know and have been coaching, and just sort of undercutting their professionalism in that way, instead of engaging them in meeting them where they are with their knowledge, and also encouraging them and empowering them to lead and to model and to integrate in all of the ways that make sense for them and their teachers. So just really thinking about everything that we bring to this moment as educators, rather than always talking about teachers like they are not knowing, not understanding beings. And I think that's one of the challenges with a law that makes space for particular trainings, is it suggests that everybody needs that training. And in many cases, it could be that you need the permission and the resources and the schedule and the tools to enact something you've known for a long time. And in some cases, yeah, this is new information for you, and thank goodness for the training. So just really thinking about the variation here in what our professionals might need and might benefit from, and acknowledging that we're not all blank slates here. We are bringing a lot to the table when we're considering what science has to teach us about literacy instruction.
Thanks for adding that. And that also reminds me of the notion that the form of PD that we are talking about here, it's learning-focused professional development versus what I would argue might be treated as compliance-based professional development. So if the professional development linked to the science of reading is to check a box and to have seat time in X number of minutes, my hunch, and I think many other implementation researchers would agree with me, and I perhaps I'm already noticing nods from folks listening in, is that it's not going to have a shot. That's going to flounder. That's not going to lead to the best and the deepest form of adult learning, which is necessary for changes in practice within classrooms. And so it's going to take a more complex type of learning and work together versus checking a box and saying, yes, I was there and listened to something that taught me something in the abstract about science of reading versus the ongoing touch points linked to daily work and my practice. So jumping into the lead. Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Jumping into the leadership pillar. Here we're turning attention to the people who set up some of these conditions, who make a lot of decisions about curriculum, instruction, what is emphasized, what is de-emphasized within schools. Leaders are people who are collecting lots of evidence on what's going on within schools, and leaders can play a role in helping to sort of advance and sort of deepen the science of reading work. But again, for this to be optimized and for this to be streamlined, leadership and instructional leadership needs to match the current approaches to reading. So in some previous work with Rachel on teacher evaluation, we made some arguments related to the way that teacher evaluation was a completely different branch of instructional leadership in many ways than the reading instructional leadership. And in certain ways, it's possible that instructional leadership work could continue to move in one direction while the district is moving or a school is attempting to move towards science of reading. And so thinking through how are the instructional leadership activities actually reflecting the principles and practices and key tenets and look-fors and all those sorts of things. I know look-fors are not everybody's favorite term, but how does instructional leadership match this direction and this movement in reading versus operating in a different direction or working in a different direction? And so for that to occur, leaders need a deep understanding of the nature of the reading curriculum and should understand how it's aligned to the science of reading, should understand strengths and limitations within the curriculum, should understand how and why teachers are using or not using the curriculum. They should also be involved in the reading professional development and in setting up professional learning opportunities for teachers. And again, in thinking about the alignment of these efforts. So again, there isn't one space or time for science of reading PD, but then it turns out within PLCs, the conversations and the work related to reading may not necessarily align with that. And again, district and school leaders, including coaches, can play a role in sort of forming that alignment. And as hinted before, district and school leaders should be engaged in ongoing professional learning on reading. And that can be time and space for them to sort of analyze evidence on how is this going within their sites. Rachel mentioned sort of the role of improvement science in this, but when district and school leaders are sitting down together and talking as a community of practice about how the implementation of reading is going within their site, that's a space to engage in these sort of incremental changes.
I think we lost Sarah.
I'll finish your sentence. It's what I
Yeah,
do.
go ahead. Why don't you? Thanks,
The space to engage in those incremental changes. It's so important to be able to be tracking progress in process instead of waiting to the end of the year or waiting to the end of 2 years from now. And the main thing that we're hoping to avoid by asking leaders to engage in this work is a year and a half from now having the exact same conversation, but about a new thing. So the new science of reading 2, or what, because we often have to sort of repackage ideas as if they're new because they're not happening. And this is something we see in terms of the policy. Like this is the same policy 3 times, but it hasn't fully come to fruition. And so we've had to kind of double down and triple down on it. And the same thing is going to happen in terms of the content of those policies. If we aren't deeply involved in integrating and aligning and making it coherent and part of all the messages being sent in and around our educators, then we are going to get this surface level compliance that isn't deep enough to make an impact on children. And then in a year or two, we're going to say we need something else, because we will. And we'll have to come back to this conversation again about paying attention to how we roll this out, because the rollout matters almost as much or more than the content itself. So this idea of collecting evidence along the way to make sure that teachers have what they need to do a good job with this, and knowing what that trajectory looks like is really, really important, so we don't end up back here in a circle again.
All
So,
right, ladies. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So here we go. This is sort of a wrap-up moment. We have these three pillars that we care a lot about: curriculum, professional development, and leadership. And what we're looking for is coherence across them. If there isn't coherence, we have competition. So instructional leadership is saying, hey, we really want you to be working on small groups and social emotional learning. But you also have a brand new reading curriculum you're trying to do. And now I've got mixed messages about what's most important and what I should spend my time on and which one I should be following if there are any contradictions between them. We want to make sure that there's coherence in the messaging about what is the priority and what are the tools and how are we going to make this work for our students, and what's expected. Is this expected just of kindergarten this year, or of all of us? Are we expected to do all of it now, or are we rolling it out slowly? Transparency for understanding is a big part of this. The curriculum, teachers have to understand where this change is coming from and why. They need to understand where this professional development is coming from and why. Otherwise, they can't, as responsible, intellectual adult learners, engage with it fully. And similarly, with instructional leadership, we need to understand there is accountability for this work. What does the accountability look like? And what is it attached to? And then finally, feasibility. And this is where, again, we've got to take this zoomed out view. We're in the middle of season 3 of the pandemic. Many schools are adopting new materials. Many schools are shorthanded at various levels. Many schools are making changes to a lot of areas, not just literacy. And so even if you had the coolest, best curriculum and you're adopting it all at once with all the bells and whistles, if you're also trying to do that with math and with social studies and with social emotional learning and with character development and with 16 other things, it's just not feasible. And that is in the best possible circumstance. If instead you have a circumstance where you would like to adopt this new curriculum, but you don't have quite all of it yet, and we don't have all of the trainings lined up perfectly yet, and maybe not everybody is quite trained yet, if we're working against some odds to do implementation, then we have to adjust the expectations and the support so that it's feasible. So I want to think about feasibility both within the work of the science of reading, like how feasible is the shift for your teachers to do in a year or in 2 years? Thinking about what curriculum and approaches and expectations they came from, and what you're asking them to shift through, and how big a difference is it? So feasibility within reading, but then also feasibility in terms of the larger work of being a teacher. Science of reading is focused on K3, and reading is not the only job of our K3 teachers. It's not the only job of our K3 leaders either. And so really thinking about what is feasible, what's manageable, what can we do well and deeply so that we can build on it. Here's what we have to think about when we're thinking for implications. A lot of folks say, all right, we had this whole idea, but we just had to learn about the science of reading and then things would be figured out. And I think there is a lot of messaging out in the media and in various reports that just suggests that if teachers knew more, they would do better. And if they did better, we wouldn't have problems. I think that's overly simplistic and also rude. So we have to acknowledge that the policies that we're forming right now around the science of reading, and many of the conversations about it, are absent an important conversation about infrastructure and implementation. We know what we need to do, but we do not yet have guidance, and we do not yet have evidence about the strongest and best way to do it. We know something about teacher learning, we know something about instructional change, but we have not seen this happen on a large scale successfully in the US. We have to think about what are the resources in every single building that we need to fortify the infrastructure. Do we have the coaches that we need? Do we have the time for collaboration that we need? Do we have the instructional leadership capacity that we need? And in order to do that, we have to assess the state of that infrastructure, do a little audit, not a little, I like to make them seem like they're small and easy. Just do a little bit of an audit, just a little audit, just audit. Seeing what is your curriculum like right now and how big a leap and in what areas is what you're asking your teachers to do. What is PD like right now and how big a change and in which areas would you need to see something be different if you wanted real deep instructional change? And what is your leadership like right now? What has it been focused on? What could it be focused on? Is this a mixed or other message from what you've been saying for the last couple of years? Is this pretty much in alignment and you just need to make small shifts? And I think especially given the year that we're talking about here, there's a long history of implementation and improvement science, and none of it, or very little of it, I should say, has been done during a pandemic. And so we have to really think about the care and the space and the wisdom that our leaders need to bring to this, and also creating conditions so that leaders can have some care and wisdom to spare, so that they can do this work well with and for their educators and their students.